The tea smelled like chamomile and betrayal, though I didn't know the second part yet. Every second Sunday of the month, we hosted book club at our house. 8 women, a rotating hostess, and a pot of herbal tea that my husband always insisted on preparing himself. He said it was his way of contributing. I thought it was sweet. I thought a lot of things about him that turned out to be wrong. My name is Hazel. I was 31 years old, a dental hygienist working out of a clinic in Oakville, Ontario. And I had been married for 4 years to a man I met at a friend's cottage weekend near Muskoka. He was charming in that quiet, deliberate way. Not loud about it, not performing. He just made you feel like the most important person in the room. And when that feeling is directed at you for long enough, you stop questioning whether it's real. We had a house we couldn't quite afford on Kerr Street, a rescue dog named Biscuit, a joint account, and a separate savings account I'd had since before we met. The one my father helped me open when I turned 19 and started working summers at the marina. By the time we married, there was a little over $60,000 in it. My father had been sick for years. Cop D, then a small stroke. And when he passed the spring before our wedding, he left me the house he'd owned outright in Fergus. We sold it, another $112,000 after fees. I want you to understand what those numbers felt like to me. They weren't just money. They were my father's overtime shifts, his packed lunches, his second-hand truck. They were the years he spent saying no to himself, so I could one day say yes. My husband knew exactly what those numbers were. The first time I passed out at book club, it was October. We'd finished a chapter of a novel set in the Maritimes, the kind of book everyone pretends to love more than they do. And I remember standing up to refill my mug, and then nothing. I came back to myself on the couch, Biscuit's wet nose against my cheek, and my friend kneeling beside me with her phone in her hand. She wanted to call an ambulance. I said no. I was embarrassed. I told everyone I hadn't eaten enough that day, which was half true. And they believed me because I was the kind of person who forgot to eat when things got busy. And things were always getting busy. My husband drove everyone home and came back and sat beside me and held my hand and said we should get me checked out. We went to the walk-in the next morning. The doctor found nothing remarkable. Blood pressure slightly low, but within normal range. She told me to eat regularly, drink water, rest. I did all of those things. The next month, at book club, I passed out again. This time I hit the edge of the coffee table on the way down. Small cut above my eyebrow. 5 minutes of real unconsciousness. My friend crying in the kitchen, while my husband knelt beside me looking. And this is the thing that didn't register until later. Almost calm. Not panicked. Not the face of a man watching his wife lose consciousness in their living room. Calm. Like a man watching something go according to plan. I didn't see it then. You don't see things you're not looking for. I went back to the walk-in. Then a GP referral. Then a neurologist at Joseph Brant Hospital who ran tests and found nothing. Blood work? Normal. Imaging? Normal. She suggested stress. Possible vasovagal syncope? Asked about my sleep. I was sleeping fine. She suggested maybe the combination of warm room, social anxiety, standing too quickly. I started sitting near the window at book club. I ate a full meal beforehand. I set a reminder on my phone to drink water every hour. 3rd Sunday of December, I passed out for the 3rd time. By then, I had started to feel like I was losing my mind. My husband was patient with me in a way that felt like performance. Gentle suggestions about whether I was overdoing it at work. Whether maybe I needed to see someone about anxiety. Whether all the stress around my father's estate had caught up with me. He never said anything that was technically unkind. He just arranged the narrative so that the problem was me. The thing that changed everything was almost accidental. January book club, I had a sore throat coming on and I didn't want to drink tea. I switched to water halfway through the evening and stuck to it. I sat in the same chair, in the same warm room, with the same women and the same slightly too long discussion about whether the protagonist of our latest book was sympathetic or just pathetic. Same everything. Except the tea. I didn't pass out. I went to bed that night thinking probably nothing, but in the morning I was still thinking about it. I didn't say anything to my husband. Instead, I started paying attention to small things I had stopped paying attention to. The way he always brought me my mug already filled, rather than letting me pour my own. The way he tidied up quickly after everyone left, rinsing the teapot himself before I could. The way he'd subtly discouraged me from switching to coffee. Tea is better for your nervous system, Hazel. Especially with everything you've been going through. In February, I poured my tea down the bathroom sink when he wasn't watching and refilled my mug with water from the tap. I sat through the entire evening. I discussed a memoir about a woman rebuilding her life after a house fire. I drove my friend home afterward. I came back and washed the dishes and looked at my husband across the kitchen and smiled and said I'd had a nice night. He watched me carefully for a moment. Then he smiled back. That was the night I understood that something was very wrong. I didn't panic. I want to say that clearly because the version of myself I had been for the past year, foggy, frightened, blaming her own body, felt very far away in that moment. Something went cold and clear inside me instead. I lay next to my husband that night and listened to him breathe and thought, okay, if this is real, I need to be careful. I need to be quiet. I need to be quiet. I need to know what I'm actually dealing with before I do anything. The next morning, while he was at the gym, I went through the cabinet under the bathroom sink where he kept his personal products. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. I found it in the back, behind a box of contact lens solution he'd had for months. A small unlabeled bottle, dark glass, maybe 60 milliliters. The kind of dropper bottle you can buy at any health food store. Inside, a pale yellowish liquid that smelled, faintly, like nothing at all. I photographed it on my phone before I put it back exactly where I found it. Then I drove to a pharmacy in Burlington, instead of the one on our street, and I bought a small plastic container and I went back home and I transferred a few drops of the liquid into it without touching the dropper to my hands, and I sealed it and put it in my coat pocket and I texted my friend, asked if she could meet me for coffee. She knew something was wrong by the time I sat down. I must have looked like I'd seen something I couldn't unsee, because I had. I told her everything. She sat with her hands wrapped around her mug, and she didn't interrupt. And when I finished, she said, very quietly, Hazel, who else knows about the inheritance? It hit me then, not gently. My father's estate had gone entirely to me. The house in Fergus, the savings he left, a small life insurance payout from a policy he'd held since the 80s. Total, after everything, just under $200,000. My husband knew the exact amount. He had been there when I met with the estate lawyer in Guelph. He had held my hand in the parking lot afterward and said my dad would be proud of me. I had moved most of it into a joint account 18 months into our marriage because he said it made sense for tax purposes. I hadn't questioned it. I trusted him. That's the thing about trusting someone completely. You stop noticing the moments when they're asking you to hand something over. I needed to know if I was right before I went to anyone official. My friend knew a private investigator, a woman who had helped her sister during a custody dispute. I called her that same afternoon. She was methodical and thorough, and she didn't make me feel like I was being paranoid. I gave her the bottle. She knew a lab in Mississauga that could test the contents, not a full forensic panel, but enough to tell us whether it contained anything that shouldn't be there. Within 2 weeks, she called me and told me that the liquid contained a combination of compounds including valerian root extract at a concentration significantly higher than any commercial supplement, alongside traces of something she described as being in the class of sedating antihistamines, enough to cause pronounced drowsiness and, depending on body weight and fasting state, temporary loss of consciousness. Not enough to kill. Enough to incapacitate, reliably, over time. He had been drugging me. Every month. At my own book club. In my own home. In a mug he filled himself and handed to me with a smile. The investigator had also been doing background work. My husband had, in the months following our marriage, increased the beneficiary designation on a life insurance policy we'd taken out jointly to a payout of $750,000. I hadn't known about the increase. The paperwork, she told me, bore my signature, or something close enough to it to have passed initial review. Forged. She said it carefully, possibly forged. And there was something else. She'd traced phone records, not the contents, but the frequency and pattern of contact between my husband and a woman I knew, his colleague from the real estate office where he worked. She had been at our house for a dinner party twice. She had once helped me carry groceries in from the car and said I had a beautiful home. She had been in contact with my husband an average of 11 times a day for the past 8 months. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a coffee shop in Hamilton, and I cried for approximately 4 minutes. Then I stopped. I had things to do. I met with a family lawyer in Toronto. I drove there specifically so no one local would recognize me. She was direct and efficient, and she explained my rights clearly. Under Ontario family law, assets I had brought into the marriage, including inheritance, were generally excluded from equalization, but only if I could prove they remained separate, which was complicated now that they'd been moved into a joint account. The forged insurance documents, if provable, changed the picture significantly. She told me to document everything and not to move money or change behavior in any way that would alert him. She also told me I should contact the police. I did. 2 days later, a detective with the Halton Regional Police took my statement for nearly 2 hours. She was calm and thorough, and at one point she slid a box of tissues across the table without comment, which I appreciated. She told me that what I was describing, the systematic drugging, the forged documents, the insurance policy, constituted, at minimum, fraud and administering a noxious substance, potentially more, depending on intent. She asked me what I believed his intent was. I told her that I believed he intended for me to eventually die in a way that looked like an ongoing medical condition, something progressive, something neurological, something that would be tragic and not suspicious given my documented history of unexplained fainting episodes, a history he had been carefully building for over a year. She wrote it down. She didn't tell me I was wrong. The plan she outlined to me was careful, and it required me to do something very hard, which was go home and behave normally. Keep the same schedule. Be warm. Be the wife he thought he had. Every instinct I had screamed against it. I did not want to be in that house, in that bed, near that person. But I understood why it mattered. If he suspected anything, he would move money, destroy evidence, and disappear into whatever version of his future he'd been building without me. I stayed. 3 weeks. I poured every cup of tea he gave me into the bathroom sink and refilled it with water. I said I loved him. I made dinner. I took Biscuit on walks in the evening, and sometimes I sat on the back step and cried quietly where he couldn't see me. The investigators built the case in the background. The lab confirmed the original bottle's contents. A forensic document examiner retained by the police compared the signature on the insurance forms to verified samples of my handwriting and concluded it was not a match. Phone records between my husband and his colleague were subpoenaed. Bank records followed. He had been transferring small amounts, never more than $4,000 at a time, which kept it under the reporting threshold, from our joint account into an account she held. Over 14 months, the total came to $67,000. On a Tuesday morning in April, when I was at work at the clinic, the detective had coordinated timing with me specifically. Halton Regional Police arrested my husband at our house on Kerr Street. He was charged with administering a noxious substance, fraud over $5,000, forgery, and attempted insurance fraud. His colleague was arrested the same morning at her office. She was charged with fraud and conspiracy. My friend drove to the clinic to tell me in person. She sat with me in the staff room, and I drank bad coffee, and Biscuit waited in her car, and I kept thinking about my father. The overtime shifts, the packed lunches, the secondhand truck. The criminal trial took 11 months. I testified for 2 days. His lawyer suggested I had been confused, prone to memory issues, possibly fabricating the events due to psychological instability. The same instability, he implied, that had caused my fainting episodes. He cited my medical records. He cited the fact that I had moved my inheritance into our joint account voluntarily. The judge was not convinced. My husband was convicted on all counts. He received a sentence of 6 years, minus time served. His colleague received 2 years less a day, to be served in the community, with conditions. Under Canadian sentencing guidelines, particularly for nonviolent fraud, the sentences reflect what the system considers proportionate. I had been prepared for this, though it did not make it feel adequate. The civil side of things moved differently. With the criminal conviction in place, my family lawyer filed to have the marriage voided on grounds of fraud, rather than proceeding through standard divorce. It was a longer process and not guaranteed, but ultimately successful. Under the voiding, the equalization provisions that might otherwise have applied did not. The joint account funds were traced and attributed. The insurance claim, which his lawyers had attempted to initiate on the basis of the forged documents during the criminal proceedings, was denied by the insurer, and the fraudulent application was formally voided. The insurance company, as part of a settlement related to their own investigation into the forged documents, paid me a fraud victim compensation amount. Not the full policy amount, but something, enough to feel like the system had acknowledged, at least partially, what had been done. I sold the house on Kerr Street. I couldn't live in it. I moved to a rental in Waterloo while I figured out what came next. I took Biscuit. I went back to work the week after sentencing, because I needed something ordinary to hold on to. The familiar mechanics of a job I was good at, patients I knew, a schedule that asked nothing of me emotionally. My friend drove out every second weekend and we watched bad television, and she never once said anything that began with "you should" or "you need to," or at least. She just sat with me. I don't have a large enough word for how much that mattered. The thing about surviving something like this is that you don't emerge from it the way stories sometimes suggest, clarified, grateful, transformed into someone wiser and lighter. You emerge from it with new knowledge about yourself that isn't comfortable. You learn that you can lie to a person you hate every day for 3 weeks and do it convincingly, which is useful information, but not flattering. You learn that grief and rage can occupy the same space without canceling each other out. You learn that trusting someone completely and being wrong about them does not mean trusting was the wrong thing. But it will be a long time before you feel that way. I still think about my father. I think about him more now than I did when he was alive. Which I understand is how grief works. Eventually, if you let it. He saved money his whole life, so I would have choices he didn't. He couldn't have imagined a choice like the one I had to make. Stay in that house, pour the tea down the drain, smile across the kitchen at a man who wanted me dead. But I think he would have recognized the instinct underneath it, the stillness, the decision to be careful instead of just frightened. A year and a half after the arrest, I finished the process of changing my name. Not because I was hiding from anyone. The criminal case was public record. My new address was findable. I wasn't running. I changed it because the name I'd been using for the past 4 years was one I'd had during a marriage that a court had determined, legally, never existed. It felt like accuracy more than escape. I'm Hazel again. Just Hazel, my father's last name. The one I had before any of this. Biscuit doesn't know the difference. He just wants his walk, and his dinner, and to sleep with his chin on my feet. And most mornings, that is enough to make the day feel like something worth starting. I used to think that being a good person was enough to protect you. That if you were honest, if you were kind, if you loved someone without holding anything back, the world would meet you somewhere close to halfway. I don't think that anymore. Not because I've become cynical, but because I've learned something more precise. Being a good person matters. It just doesn't make you immune. What actually kept me safe wasn't luck. It was paying attention. That one January night when I switched my tea for water wasn't dramatic. I wasn't following a hunch or acting on some gut instinct that made for a good story later. I was just tired of not understanding what was happening to my own body, and I started treating the question seriously instead of waiting for someone else to answer it. That's the thing I come back to when I think about all of it. The moment things changed wasn't the arrest, or the trial, or the day the verdict came back. It was the moment I decided that my confusion deserved to be taken seriously. That I deserved to be taken seriously. Hazel's father spent his whole life being careful so that she could have choices. He didn't do it expecting anything in return. That's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not grand gestures, but the quiet, consistent decision to do right by someone, even when no one is watching and there's no immediate reward. He built something real. And when it mattered most, Hazel fought to protect what he'd left her, not just because it was money, but because it represented something that shouldn't be stolen. There's a kind of moral clarity that comes from knowing who you're fighting for, even after they're gone. The investigator, the lawyer, the detective who slid the tissue box across the table without comment. None of them could have done anything without Hazel doing the harder part first, which was refusing to be gaslit into believing she was the problem. That takes a particular kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on any test. It's the intelligence of noticing the thing that doesn't fit, of sitting with discomfort long enough to ask why it's there, of not accepting a convenient explanation just because it's easier than the real one. She didn't have all the answers. She just kept asking the right questions. And then there's the 3 weeks she spent in that house, pouring tea down the sink, cooking dinner, saying goodnight. I don't think most people understand how much that cost her. That kind of steadiness, the ability to keep going when everything in you wants to run, isn't something you either have or you don't. It's something you find out about yourself only when you're asked for it. Hazel found out she had it. Most of us won't know until we're tested, and maybe that's fine. Maybe it's enough to know that it's possible. What her husband did will follow him for the rest of his life, not just legally, but in the way that actions have weight that doesn't disappear when consequences are handed down. And Hazel, who changed her name back and took her dog for walks and went back to work the week after sentencing, she gets to find out who she is without him. That's not a small thing. That might be everything.